This is the Elephant in the Room, the European University Institute Equity, Diversity and Inclusion podcast. In each episode, we explore how factors such as gender and gender identity, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, religion or belief, disability, weight play a role in all aspects of our society, from our places of work to politics, from culture to history, food, and everything in between. Together with our guests, we reflect on the intersectionality of these dimensions, both within the underrepresented groups embodying multiple identities and in the broader society. This podcast makes all of us part of the conversation because we are all part of the story. Hello, Elisa. Welcome to the Elephant in the Room. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Thanks for having me.
Great. So before we start with our conversation, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. My name is Elisa. I'm a historian and I'm a Max Weber Fellow here at the EOI in my second year. I have a background in gender and queer history, and in my postdoc project I kind of turned to disability history, and I work on a project on disability rights activism, knowledge production and self-perception of people with disabilities from the 1970s to 1990s in Central Europe.
Sounds very exciting. Actually, so as you said, your work, it's really at the intersection between gender studies, intersectionality studies, sexuality, disability. Can you tell us a little bit more about what connects all these topics together, perhaps for listeners who are not very used to this type of research?
Sure. That's a very good question, and one that I've been asked more and more since being a postdoc, because I think suddenly you realize there are several topics and sets of questions that you've worked on over the years, and I think it's a good exercise to realize what connects them actually, besides you being just fascinated by them. So I think in my case, my interest in all of these fields is connected to the fact that since very early in my undergraduate studies, I was very much interested in how history is actually written. So what is considered the important history? We may think of the history of empires, the history of great men and their achievements, and so on. And what stories and histories are sidelined in history as well as in historical debates. And that obviously has drawn me to women's history, to queer history, and later to the category of disability. Because obviously inherent in all of these topics are questions of what is considered an unquestionable norm and what is seen as a specialty or an add-on. So I think I can't count how many books I've seen, like high school history books, but also scholarly works that tell the story of something. And then there is one chapter near the end, of course, that covers kind of the women's experience within this time or whatever. So the sheer othering of women in that context is very tangible. And clearly the main problem is not that these books talk about men, it is the fact that they do without saying so. So they normalize the male experience. The same with heterosexuality or able-bodiedness, and this is still very common. And as I said, I think this also applies to heterosexuality or able-bodiedness. So, for example, when we read there is a study about couples or families, it's assumed you're talking about heterosexual constellations. Otherwise, it has to be stated. Or when we are not explicitly writing about people with disabilities, we kind of see a healthy, fairly young, robust person. I think that what really connects all of these fields is that they first appear to be some specificity, like a subfield in history. But when you take a closer look, you see that all of these categories play a part in so many areas, in so many topics, meaning you can apply it as a lens, kind of, to so many different questions. And I think to do that often invites us to not only think about marginalization, othering, discrimination, it also tells us a lot about processes of normalization, how certain stories and subjects inhabit a certain space and claim this is normal. This is what you need to know about a subject, for example.
This is what I found very interesting and new, in my view, from what I read about your research, about your exploration of what normal and what normalcy was in history, and how both the majority and at the same time the minorities were able to play or to interpret this word in different ways. And it really resonated with me because I think the question of normalcy and what's normal, what bodies, what identities, what families are normal is still something that we are struggling or we are debating today. And so I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about what you found in your historical research about normalcy and how it was defined by the different groups that you have studied.
One important lesson when I did my PhD on intimate relationships in the first women's movement in Germany around 1900. So one important lesson for me was that there is not a single normalcy in a way, not even at the same point in time in one national context. So, for example, in my research, when we think of this first women's movement in Germany, we're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century. And I started working on this project and I had a pretty clear idea what to expect from a time like this. So I thought that the discourse on homosexuality, legally, male homosexuality was a criminal offense and female homosexuality was not, but there were attempts starting from 1902 to make it illegal as well. So I thought about a conservative society that treated women as inferior. They were not allowed to go to university and so on. So I had the idea that relationships between women would have been also condemned, that these women would have needed to live their relationships in secrecy. And then I learned that in the women's movement, there were a lot of female couples, very respected, very out in a way from today's perspective. So living in these kind of couple relationships was very common and pretty normal to them under certain circumstances. So this was another kind of normality that they were living. And I think the learning for me here was that norms are not universal, static. Norms are always contested, they are negotiated, they are built up and torn down by different groups and actors. And when we think about today, a world where unfortunately there are very rigid ideas of normality operating again, I think that this can also give us hope in a way, because there is room for contesting norms, for bringing in alternative views, even though these possibilities are often quite limited. But from my experience as an activist, and I've been an activist for many years, I think I have experienced the frustration of not being heard, but I've also experienced the joy and the gratification if something worked out. So if we were able to create something, to create a space, a safe space, for example, for a certain group, or a space of alternative living.
Sounds fascinating. It seems that there is always this play or this reimagining the relationship between visible and invisible, and how invisibility can become almost a tool that you can use to grow and to express who you are, but at the same time at some point you also need to become more visible and to use activism in a way and to be an activist, especially if you're part of a marginalized community. I was wondering, in this sense, you said you are an activist yourself. And so in your work, you also reflected on how certain words had been used in different ways to define in a normative way certain categories, but also as an instrument for liberations, like words such as homosexual or lesbian, or I took note of the word cripple that you mentioned in your research. Maybe you want to say a little bit more about that now in a moment. And so to go back to what you were saying about activism, how did these women use activism to fight discrimination or to live within a discriminatory environment? And what can we learn from them today?
So I think, you mentioned these words like homosexual, lesbian, or cripple, which translates to cripple in English. I think what unites all these words, and activists have positioned themselves differently to them and have used them differently, but what unites them is they started out being quite pathologizing, derogatory terms. So they were used intentionally or not as words that othered, had a marginalizing, degrading effect on certain groups. And a strategy we see across different social movements, so not only in the early homosexual movement or the disability rights movement, throughout the 20th century, we see that groups who were subjected to this kind of language often appropriated these words in order to deprive them of this initial meaning or this derogatory meaning. So using expressions like krüppel, for example, a very, very harmful expression, it meant kind of claiming or reclaiming a term that was originally meant to harm. They adopted these terms in an emancipatory way to strip it of its derogatory power. And I think if we really think about it, it's a really interesting strategy because it doesn't try to explain to the person who uses this kind of word, oh, this is harmful, or this is problematic, or please don't use this, or something like that. It is more about just taking the tools that these people use, by taking the intended notion from them in a way. And I mean, coming from my experience as an activist, I think this strategy is by no means only a historical one. I've seen very similar strategies in demonstrations or political interventions. So I could bring an example from Vienna, where I'm from. So for many years, there has been the so-called family march taking place at the exact same day of the Pride Parade in Vienna. So no coincidence, of course. It is, compared to the Pride, a relatively small gathering, mostly of anti-abortion activists and very homophobic, transphobic people. So when these activists were shouting at us in the Pride, you know, perverts, you're like, you try to destroy the ideal of the heterosexual family, we were like, oh yes, exactly, like this is, you got that right, like just, you know, giving it back and saying, oh yes, exactly, that is, you know, you think we are radical, oh yes we are. Or in the LGBT squad that I was living in for a few years, we created a slogan that was switch off your common sense, and that was mostly a reaction to people around us saying, you know, this is going too far. Why do you need drag queens at these events? This is also sexualized. If queer people would act more normal, they would be more accepted. So we addressed that very idea of the common sense, this idea of conforming to normality, by contesting what they thought was common sense. Still, this was a really great campaign we did, yeah.
I think it was great indeed. And I think it goes back also to an effort that marginalized groups need to do about subverting words, subverting terms, and also questioning how we are labeled. And by the way, labels can be quite damaging also for the majority. In that sense, I was thinking about your research, and so to these women who were part of activist movements and they were in relationships. And if I'm translating correctly your research, you found out and you understood at some point that the terms that we are using today, like homosexuals or to define a homosexual couple, were limiting to describe these types of relationships. And it really connects in my mind very well with the idea of subverting norms that are applied onto us, but also going beyond the definitions that are given to us. And so I was wondering what you found about these relationships, and I think you also came up with a new framework in a way.
Thank you for that question. I love to talk about my PhD. I worked on these, as I said, like as you mentioned now, on these relationships, couple relationships in the women's movement. And what I came across, as you said, pretty early on in my work was that these women didn't identify as homosexual or lesbian, even though these terms had just been invented. So they were there, but they didn't use it at all. And I realized that if I had just used these terms to analyze my sources, I would have come up with close to nothing. I would have just been able to say, well, there were these women living together, but whatever, you know, we don't know anything about them. They didn't identify with these terms, so we just don't know. I wanted to go beyond that, of course, especially because it was for me so apparent that these women were not only living in kind of marriage-like relationships, but also that they spent most of their lives among women. This was really a homosocial sphere in which they were living, and this was really fascinating to me. And so for me, an important step was to kind of render categories such as homosexuality unfamiliar in a way, so to historicize them, because as I said, like the term homosexual had actually just been invented 50 years ago, so it was really it was a kind of a new term, and to try to deprive them, these concepts, of their supposed self-evidence. And this meant for me recognizing that these concepts give a name to an already existing phenomenon, but instead grouped certain existing practices together under one identity. And these new sexological concepts, they created an opportunity to claim that identity, and a lot of people did. I mean, the homosexual movement at the time is really starting out with Magnus Hirschfeld, with the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and so on. So we see a lot of individuals are starting to identify with these sexological concepts, such as homosexuality. But there was also, like in the women's movement, the option of not claiming these concepts and use different concepts, different terms and categories instead. So historicizing the categories when we analyze sexuality in the past makes us see, I think, the different ways in which relationships, affective ties have been conceptualized through history. And I think for me, as you said, I came up with a new framework because I had to find a concept or a term that would give me the opportunity to analyze what I was seeing. And that for me was intimacy as a concept that was broad enough to cover all the different practices that I was seeing. And maybe one thing I want to add as well is that this kind of cautious attitude when it comes to terms and language, I think that is really informing still my current research and my past research, also my activist practice, because I think it's always a good idea to think of terms and labels as something with a history. So something that has to do with power. Who names who, under which circumstances, and that terms are very rarely neutral or self-evident.
Absolutely. It reminds me about a research I did years ago about prisoners who identify as LGBTQ+, and at some point by interviewing them, I also realized that the categories of homosexuality, being in a homosexual relationship or just describing these relationships as sexual, were not sufficient. So it's something that happens quite a lot in very heavily normative environments and in the broader society. It reminds me also of events that are happening today and new forms of activism and new generations that in recent years have started to challenge again the notions of the letters of the acronym, of the letters in the LGBTQ plus acronym, and they sometimes challenge the assumption that we should all be labeled. They introduced more vocally, I think, a notion of fluidity and maybe even abandoning sometimes in certain contexts, certain labels were to be defined. And this created a lot of backlash. Politically, even, we saw the US and backlash against the EDI programs, how certain terms have been completely erased of official documentation and official website of the US government. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that and if you saw any parallel with what you researched in the historical period that you looked into.
I mean, this brings us back again to how important language is, right?
Right.
Like when we think of the words and the phrases, you mentioned the ban of certain words and terms in the US. When we think of the actual words that were banned from official documents, these are like the social inequality, racism, social justice, and so on. So like key concepts of discourse about equality that should be just erased. But there are also words like LGBTQ, women, immigrants, and that not only targets discourse or political concepts, but it also tries kind of to eliminate the very existence of these groups by banning these words. And as a historian, I obviously see parallels to authoritarian regimes in the past that used language in similar ways, either by banning words or introducing new ones to depoliticize them. I mean, we can think of, book burnings during National Socialism, but we can also more recently think about Russia's law against homosexual propaganda that was introduced in 2014, I think, and so targeting so-called non-traditional sexual relationships. And this kind of laws prohibit sharing also even neutral depictions of what they call non-traditional relationships. And it becomes, I think, very, very difficult as activists to navigate such a space. I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about recently. I think as activists, we also have to be careful to not comply with these strategies that we see. So when we, for example, stop talking about equality because this is suddenly a difficult word, or about bias, about hierarchies, and try to use less politicized words. I mean, there are concepts like well-being, for example. I don't have anything against well-being, but it is a very broad term. for me, in a way, depoliticized term. I think it's fine to use it, but I think we should not shy away from still using clear words and not hide the potential of these concepts and say, as I said, when talking about the strategies I was witnessing or part of in Vienna, to say we are radical. We are as radical as you think in our vision of a different society. So no need to kind of sugarcoat that.
Absolutely, and it makes me think that also the DEI acronym, in a way, was, at least in certain sectors, was a way to depoliticize other terms like discrimination, equal opportunities, civil rights movements. Yes. And we always need to, you're right, we need to be careful and to remember why we are using these words and where they come from, and not to lose the radicality, more powerful and rooted in history terms. I was also thinking while you were talking about the role of activists and how I believe they found themselves in a very difficult position today, as you were saying, because on one side you have governments, state officials, political movements trying to literally erase marginalized groups and any form of challenging the status quo or challenging power. On the other hand, these same movements are also attacking academia. They are attacking universities. They seek to limit universities' academic freedom. But at the beginning of our conversation, you were also talking about knowledge production as a concept that you worked on and how activists can become knowledge producers. And so can you say a little bit more about what it means in the relationship between activists and academics, what it means to be an activist and an academic, and what kind of challenges all this bring into play?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating topic to me. So I've been studying social movements for quite some time now, and what strikes me is how much activist groups have shaped the knowledge on certain topics that eventually ended up being part of academic knowledge. So this applies to disability as well as gender and queer studies, because in all of these fields, the main impetus for academic research and debate came from social movements. The protagonists in these movements very often also had been active as knowledge producers. So they were often the first to kind of conduct research, if it was not called that, but like in a way conduct research and write and discuss queer experiences, gender nonconformity, disability, etc., from the perspective of those affected or concerned in firsthand. So when we look at these fields today, there is kind of a mirroring effect. There is another significant overlap between activism or advocacy and research, because much of the work within disability, gender and queer studies not only analyzes social inequalities, but also positions itself as inherently political in a way. And this applies also to the protagonists of these movements or in academia, because scholars in these fields often engage in activism beyond academia. They serve on advisory committees or policy boards, or they participate in NGOs, or they are part of activist groups. And I think there's another layer that is really, really important to me, and that concerns epistemic authority. Because when we're doing this kind of research on certain marginalized groups, I think we should also reflect on how we can involve people who are directly affected or concerned in our research projects. And since I've been working on disability history, I've been thinking a lot about this very famous slogan, "Nothing about us without us." It's a widely used slogan in disability rights groups, and it kind of asserts that no policy that concerns or that affects people with disabilities should be made without their direct involvement. And for the last couple of months, I was really thinking about how could we apply something like this also in research. And I think it really raises important questions. It challenges us to consider who is recognized as an expert, who is granted the authority to speak on certain topics, and how, in general, power relations shape knowledge production and epistemic authority. Also, in exchange with colleagues, I was thinking a lot about ways and methods that we could use to bring these groups more into our research. So we could reflect on, for example, what could allyship mean in research? How could we make our research more accessible? I mean, of course, you know what I'm talking about. This is like the whole question of accessibility of knowledge, and also how we can maybe offer the groups that we are working on, that we are studying, something in return when we do the research.
These are very, very important questions, and also the point of how to engage with representatives of these communities, but also ensuring not to exploit them or using them as forms of tokenism is quite a challenge. And do you think that the current climate that we were talking about in a way could also bring new opportunities in this sense? So some forms of, in politics they would call it resistance, maybe another term is more appropriate when it comes to research and academia, and some forms of activism. But can we find some hope even in dark times in your view? I know it's a big question.
No, I'm definitely convinced that there's a great potential for that, because I think when we talk about this whole issue of epistemic authority and power relations, there are more and more people who think about how can we, for example, establish focus groups, or I've read a lot about queer takes on oral history, for example, and how we can really make the relationship between an interviewer and interviewee more reciprocal and try to maybe collaborate, bring those people to the ivory tower and not think that we can kind of extract the knowledge that they have and just use it. So I would definitely say there is a potential. Also, when I was teaching at different universities on queer history, disability history, I see that students are often super creative and have a lot of ideas how to make knowledge production a more democratic process also at universities.
Definitely, I can also see the change when I look at students, and there are some, I think, areas of research where I see this change happening, or at least new questioning about these issues and the research methodologies that we are using as academic institutions. Perhaps we can bring a contribution to this discussion by thinking, and if you have any view on misconception that we still have when it comes to the history of sexuality and disability activism, things that we take for granted or we assume, perhaps because we don't engage as academic communities and members of academic institutions with these same groups that we may debunk today. Let's be ambitious.
One thing would be, I made that point before, is that I'm convinced that it is really important to historicize categories and to not think of them as self-evident, but as having a history, or that comes mostly from my engagement with the history of sexuality. But there is another point regarding disability that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that I think we have to really broaden our idea of what activism actually is or what it entails. Because when we think of it, people with disabilities are hardly ever perceived as actors in their own lives, let alone as activists, but they are more perceived as kind of receivers of political decisions. And I think it's really crucial to unlearn kind of these common assumptions of what activism means and not limit our imagination, for example, to demonstrations in the street, handing out flyers or holding up signs, because there have been so many ways of politicizing disability in different publics since the 1970s that should just not be overlooked. Things like what I call activist writing, intervening in political events, of course, artistic and performative practices, or documentaries that were produced. So a lot of very, very creative activist practices. And I think it's really important to apply such a broad concept or idea of activism and really show the variety of practices that people with disabilities engaged with and still engage in.
This sounds very liberating. And also as allies, I think it's something that it's important to learn and reflect on, and not to be too limited by our own conceptions of certain norms. And again, terms change and can be enriched and interpreted differently. Thank you. This was a very beautiful conversation, Elisa. I could go on for hours listening to you and your work and your research. But I think our time is over for today. But I would like to ask you a question that we ask to all our guests at the end of our episodes. Do you have a book, a podcast, a movie, a song, any form of art that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I have something that is a movie I saw a few years ago. It's called Große Freiheit in German, Great Freedom in the translation. It's by German director Sebastian Meise. It is about the persecution of homosexual men during National Socialism and in the decades after the Second World War in the Federal Republic of Germany, because male homosexuality was persecuted there until 1969. So that is also already like an important learning from that movie. So the movie tells the story of Hans Hoffmann, who is incarcerated for the same crime, having consensual sex with other men, in the 40s, in the 50s, and in the 60s. And because the movie is not telling the story as a linear narrative, so it works with flashbacks and with different kinds of collage, the audience gets a very good sense of how, for gay men, nothing really changed after the end of National Socialism, besides not being incarcerated in concentration camps, but still. And I think this is one reason why I like the movie a lot, because it contradicts kind of the narrative of how everything supposedly gets better and better for queer people in the second half of the 20th century, while it obviously didn't. It took a very long time for things to get better, and still there's like a lot of contradiction there. And the other reason why I like the movie a lot is that it doesn't take a fixed idea of sexual identity as a starting point. So in prison, Hans is having an on-off relationship with Victor, a very brutal, violent, homophobic man. But the way this relationship evolves in the course of the movie is, for me, an incredible example of how to tell the story of queer lives during this time, because it tells, on the one hand, the story of persecution by the Nazis and the German state using this distinct category of homosexuality, but it also tells the story of the fluidity and the temporality of sexual identities, of contradictions and uncertainties. So that's why I definitely recommend this movie.
Wow, definitely. We're going to watch it for sure. It sounds super interesting. I hope there are English subtitles as well.
I think it's there must be an English version, I'm sure. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe.
See you soon around the EDI. The Elephant in the Room is recorded by Giuseppe Zago, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the EUI, and produced and edited by Valentina Caso, HR Communications Assistant, and Anna Ferrandino, EDI Assistant. We thank Radio Cavolo for providing the space and equipment, and a special thanks to Andrea Lee, EUI Communications Officer, who co-created the concept of this podcast.